Hey, thanks for joining me today for episode 54 of Podcasting Your Brand. I'm your host, producer Jemmy, providing learning lessons for you to podcast your brand. And today I'm going to share a podcasting 101 topic, keeping your solo episodes within scope. This episode is brought to you by my own brand, Flintstone Media. Listen in and let's do this. Welcome back for another episode geared at helping you with your solo content. In particular, how to keep the content you are preparing for each episode within a good scope. Not too little, not too much. Just like Goldilocks, you want to make the scope of your content just right. And part of that decision comes from keeping your listener in mind, and some of that comes from keeping yourself in mind. On the last episode, we talked about how to structure your solo content, ending with a note on being mindful of keeping your content on those episodes within scope. So let's dive into that today. And it starts with what everything you do in podcasting should start with: your listener. You want to keep your listener in mind when deciding the level of your presentation. What I mean by that is, how deep into the weeds should you go? How much should you nerd out? Trust me, in talking about podcasting, I have to hold the reins back on myself a lot. And in planning for the show overall, I knew that you may be somebody who is just considering podcasting. You may be someone in the middle of launching a podcast, or you may be someone who's gotten off the ground. You may be podcasting for a little bit, but you want to know how to make it better. Or it could mean that you're a veteran looking to another veteran for some tips from my journey in this space. And that's why I ultimately decided to have episodes that would speak on topics on different levels. Hence, that some episodes are podcasting 101 like this one, and others are podcasting 102. But you may have an audience with fewer divisions to it. And if that's the case, then you should really aim the level of your content for your target audience. If your audience is newer to the content, then keep the content more entry level. But if you are aiming for a target audience that is already knowledgeable on your subject and you want to bring them to the next level, then you should take things deeper into the weeds. So that's what you need to keep your listener in mind for: deciding what level your content should be delivered on. Then keep yourself in mind when deciding how deep to go in your prep. That truly will depend, honestly, on what works best for you. Will you want to prep your notes with just a few bullet points that you can then just naturally flow off on? If that works for you, fantastic. Welcome to the wonderful world of shorter prep. Or perhaps you'd be more comfortable with more fleshed out notes, or maybe you need to prepare notes that are even more like fully scripted. The point is that you're going to be discovering the method of prepping your notes that works for you. By the way, what do you think I do for this show? What's your guess? Do you think that I just do bullet points? Do you think I have fleshed out notes? Or do you think I have a full script? The world may never know. But you'll discover what method of prep works best for you over time. And it may require some experimenting here and there. Try with just a few bullet points. How does it sound when you're done with it? Does it still sound coherent? Fantastic. You can experiment. Or it may even change from one episode to the next, depending on the subject matter and topic that you're specifically covering on that episode. Perhaps you had to do a little bit of research in order to feel more comfortable really talking about that. So your notes might end up being a little more fleshed out, as an example. Bottom line, do what works best for you in terms of how detailed your prep notes need to be. So keep your listener in mind when deciding the level of your presentation and how deep in the weeds your details should go, but then keep yourself in mind when deciding on how deep to go in your prep. Okay? What notes do you actually need to have on paper or on screen or whatever, so when you get on that microphone, you can let it ride. And you'll want to keep both your listeners and yourself in mind when figuring out the flow and the tone that you want to use when you do take that prep to the microphone. Should it be more edutainment with room for laughs, or should you be more buttoned up? The answer to that question specifically lies at the intersection of your target listener. How are they best going to absorb your information? Is it through quick, practical snippets and tips, kind of what I try to aim for on this show? Is it through fleshed out storied examples, which I also share a little bit on this show? Or is there some other method? Also at that intersection, aside from just your target listener, is your own personality. Are you naturally quippy? Are you naturally more straightforward? Be yourself on the microphone. And the flow and tone of your solo content will depend on one more thing. The subject matter. Clearly, if you are speaking on something very serious, like human trafficking, your flow and tone would be very different, or at least for the love of all that's holy, I hope it would be, than if you were talking about training puppies, right? Or something much more light that you can bring a lot more levity onto the microphone. Those two shows should be very different from each other in tone. And there's no real way to explain exactly how to make that assessment other than just encouraging you to go by your own common sense and instinct. You have conversations with strangers. You have conversations for jobs. You have conversations for all kinds of things in your daily life. However you decide in that quick moment to approach that conversation, use that same gut instinct and skill when you get on the microphone to talk about your subject matter. But another place when you're talking about solo content, especially, another place where your instinct needs to be turned all the way up is in terms of being mindful to avoid making solo content all about you. Chances are pretty good that's not what your listeners are there for. They're there to be informed or entertained about the subject matter of your show and to gain the value that you've promised them in exchange for their time. So unless your show is all about you, again, not likely. And if you need detailed thoughts on why, you can rewind back to episode 33. No infomercials, please. Then make sure to keep the value about your listeners' needs, not about you, about your listeners' needs. So don't just start talking about how wonderful you are at pushing the art industry forward, or about how you wrote the book on gaining the most out of your stock portfolio. Like, no one cares about that. Don't do that. They care about how your information is going to help them. But using examples from your own experience to illustrate your information and teachings is phenomenal. And don't be afraid to share stories of your losses along with stories of your wins. And I'll get into more of why that can work in your favor too, sharing your losses just as much as your wins on the next episode. But you definitely want to do both. And using your own examples naturally showcases your vast experience and your expertise, which can be great for positioning. But don't make the show about yourself. Just use your own example of something when an example is called for. But don't force it, okay? Don't force it in order to, quote unquote, sell yourself on that microphone. That is not going to come across well. The listener's going to realize there's not a whole lot of value that's about them, and they won't tune back in. Instead, promote whatever it is that you do want to promote and you're itching to promote and you want to tell them about that you want them to take action on. Promote that through your closing calls to action at the end. And so any calls to action that you share throughout the episode that might be sprinkled in for your listeners, if they're within the main body of the episode, those calls to action should be reserved to only reference additional resources for your listeners and not much else. Okay? Again, avoid making your episodes become salesy. I truly cannot emphasize that enough. That is what closing calls to action are for. So when it comes to scope, again, think of your listener when deciding how deep in the weeds you want your content to be. Think of yourself when deciding how deep your prep should be. And think of your listener, yourself, and your subject matter when deciding the tone to take on the microphone. Okay, so now let's say you are on the microphone. What's one thing that you might think I don't want you to be worried about? I'll give you a couple of seconds to come up with a guess. Do, 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 do. And actually, my giving you a couple of seconds was a little bit of a clue in and of itself, because the answer is time. I don't want you to be thinking about time. When you get on that microphone, push time out of your head. Think about your content and nothing else. And that means not rushing and not stretching. 2 no-nos that I want you to avoid. Do not rush and do not stretch. First, with not rushing. It's okay to let thoughts breathe. Like just a moment ago when I had you try to guess what I didn't want you to be thinking about when you get on the microphone. That was a moment where I let the thought breathe. It was obvious I was asking you to try to guess something. But sometimes, usually, it's more because it's a profound thought, or those don't happen very often on the show, or it's a learning lesson that you as a host, you need to let sink in. And also keep in mind that people have a tendency to talk much faster when they feel that spotlight on them. So as you're on the microphone, and even when it's just you in the room, sometimes even especially when it's just you, it can really feel like that too. Literally, even if no one's around, you have your audience in your head. And as much as that can be a very, very good thing, I talk to you all the time about keeping your listeners front of mind. So as much as that can be a good thing, feeling like you're under a spotlight can also make you speed up like Speedy Gonzalez. What I said there was, can also make you speed up like Speedy Gonzalez. So keep that in mind and try to maintain a more normal pace for yourself. And on the opposite end, don't stretch. Do not stretch. If you feel like you've taught a complete lesson, shared a full scope of information, or whatever goal you set out to accomplish on that episode, if it takes 7 minutes and your episodes are usually 20, what should you do? Should you stretch the 7 to 20? Should you pair the content for those 7 minutes with another lesson that combined come to about 20 minutes? No, none of the above. If you have a full lesson and it takes 7 minutes, then guess what? You're releasing an episode that is 7 minutes long. If you try to stretch your content gets stale and boring. If you try to pair it with another lesson, the episode as a whole can then be overwhelming. Or that first lesson, that first 7 minutes that you got on the microphone to talk about in the first place, it gets lost behind the second one that you paired it with. So neither one of those is your best move. Let a 7-minute lesson be a 7-minute lesson. Now, I have an entire future episode plan to specifically tackle the topic of how long your episode should be, but a time target cannot and should not take precedence over whether you sufficiently cover your topic, cover it too much, or like Goldilocks, get it just right. So as my final note for you today, because there's no need to stretch this episode, I've said what I need to say. I hope this episode demonstrated what might count as going out of scope. What do I mean by that? Not this episode exactly, but had I tried jamming all of today's information into my last episode on structuring your solo content, it would have been way too much for one single episode of this show for my ideal listener that I'm targeting, you. So I kept this lesson separate. And have you heard me mention the OWL app yet? Of course you have, unless this is your first episode. And welcome! Let me tell you about the OWL app. You want to make sure that you download it today so you can be monetizing your expertise. Let people pick your brain on the OWL app, spelled with 2 W's and 2 L's, after they first picked their payment method. Sign up with my referral code PL954123 and you'll get your $10 credit. Then catch me on there for your very own one-on-one on-demand podcast coaching session. And be sure to subscribe to one of my other shows, the new Owl Podcast. I'm proudly co-hosting it with the founder of the Owl app himself, my friend, Mr. Jason Hill. And we are welcoming experts from the Owl app who are masters of their fields to come get on the microphone with us and explore the power of connection and developing your expertise. So listen into the Owl Podcast, 2 W's, 2 L's, to connect, learn, and grow. In the meantime, I have a whole host of free tips for you on my website. Just check out flintstonemedia.com/free tips. And up next on episode 55, I'll continue with taking your solo episodes up a notch with level 102. So if you're not subscribed yet, be sure you do. Thanks for tuning into Podcasting Your Brand. In this chapter of the show, I'm revealing how you can harness the power of podcasting to expand your brand. So come and pick up what I've been putting down since 2014. Avoid common mistakes, propel your podcasting and branding forward. And if you have questions or are interested in becoming a sponsoring brand of this show, don't be shy. Reach out to me at Jemmy, spelled Jaime, at flintstonemedia.com. It's producer Jemmy signing off for now. Remember, the only thing more powerful than your voice is your spirit to use it. So turn that mic on.